Vamos.
Clavo con clavo, soga con sal, todos los corruptos van a temblar. Cuando me suba el castigo.
Buenas tardes. Esperamos un ratito para que se vayan conectando. Buenas a todos, a todas. Estamos de vuelta con el Facebook Live Café de Kilómetro Cero. Hoy tenemos una super invitada y un programa interesante en el cual vamos a hablar de asuntos que siempre nos interesan. Pero aquí estoy nuevamente. Soy Mari Narváez, directora ejecutiva de Kilómetro Cero, y estoy con mi compañero de todos los Facebook Lives, Luis Calderón. Hola, Luis.
Hola, Mari. Hola, Marisol y la gente que está conectada, esperando nuestro Facebook Live ya de martes y viernes.
Tenemos una súper invitada hoy. Estoy bien contenta, primero de verla, aunque sea por Zoom, porque no nos hemos visto desde hace tiempo. Tenemos aquí a la profesora Marisol Lebrón, quien es profesora de Latino Studies en la Universidad de Texas en Austin, y además es una gran colaboradora de Kilómetro Cero. Hicimos una actividad el año pasado para presentar su libro Policing Life and Death. Marisol, buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes, gracias por la invitación.
¿Cómo está la cuarentena en Austin?
Aburrida, pero es mejor que no sea tan interesante, yo creo.
Marisol siempre nos ha traído, ¿verdad?, perspectivas muy únicas, perspectivas muy estudiadas. Algunas de ellas también son originales, o sea, innovadoras por todo, ¿verdad?, los estudios que ella ha hecho especialmente, muy especialmente de la Policía de Puerto Rico. Así que hoy vamos a estar hablando lo que hemos llamado, este Facebook Live lo hemos llamado, déjame empezar me disculpan, pero yo tengo que hacer muchas cosas aquí. Tengo que compartir el live. Hoy vamos a estar hablando sobre Policing Vulnerability in Times of COVID. Vamos a tener un Facebook Live yo no diría en Spanglish, pero puede ser que sea en Spanglish, pero como híbrido, ¿verdad? Híbrido, porque Marisol habla muy bien el español, pero se siente más cómoda hablando inglés.
Yo creo que es más fácil para todo el mundo si hablan inglés, porque mi español está como medio matado. So.
Okay. Ella dice eso, pero no está tan matado.
Yo lo escucho
bien. El español de ella está súper mega bien. Pero bueno, no importa, porque cuando yo voy a Estados Unidos me encantaría también, o sea, yo quiero que me dejen hablar español cada vez que pueda, porque yo me explico mucho mejor en español. Así que cada quien habla el idioma que se sienta más cómodo o cómoda. Así que nosotros hablamos español, ella habla en inglés y no hay problema. Policing Vulnerability, Marisol. Queríamos, ¿verdad?, hablar sobre en estos tiempos que tú sabes muy bien lo que hemos vivido en Puerto Rico. En todas partes se ha vivido, pero en Puerto Rico se ha vivido a niveles muy críticos el asunto de los toques de queda, de la utilización de la policía, el uso de la policía para asuntos que son de salud pública, ¿verdad? Entonces, ¿cómo hemos terminado criminalizando a la gente en una pandemia en lugar de, ¿verdad?, de buscar soluciones o alternativas para todo lo contrario, para que nos baje un poco la ansiedad que ya tenemos? Ha sido todo lo contrario. Tú tienes mucho que decir sobre eso. Podemos empezar por ahí sobre cuál es el problema de usar a la policía para asuntos de salud pública, y también, tú sabes, considerando que mucha gente no se imagina cómo hubiese podido ocurrir esto de que la gente se encerrara a su casa si no es porque tienes a la policía afuera amenazando con arrestarte. Eso es una realidad.
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing, and this is something that we see in Puerto Rico generally, right, is that the idea that the police can solve any social problem, right? And so the use of the police to solve anything that kind of comes up in terms of creating any sense of public insecurity or concern, right? So anything from drugs to violence to things like what should be treated as public health issues, right? And so this is not unique kind of what's happening in this moment. It has a very long trajectory of the way that the use of the PRPD has been expanded, right? So they get called out for everything, right? So it's not surprising that the government, instead of searching for actual public health kind of responses and consulting with public health officials, is treating this issue as an issue of security, right? And so there's a couple of problems with doing that, right? One is what you said, right? The idea that you have to be concerned that if you go out to the grocery store or to walk your dog or even to just get fresh air, right? You step outside to get fresh air, that you might encounter a police officer outside that's going to be enforcing the toque de queda or the stay-at-home orders, and then is going to possibly end up in a situation of hostility or harassment or violence, right? So one, that assumes that the only way that people are going to do what they're supposed to be doing during this quarantine is with the threat of violence, right? So we know that what the police are is the state's threat of violence against citizens, right? So that's the number one kind of biggest problem, right? Is it assumes that the only way people are going to do what they're supposed to do is if you threaten them with violence. But the other issue with using the police as a kind of tool of public health is that research has shown, both from public health officials as well as activists who are doing kind of public health work and community work, that the police are actually key instigators of violence, particularly in the lives of the most vulnerable populations. So immigrants, poor folks, Black folks, and non-white kind of people of color, right? These are the populations that are the most likely to encounter the police. And when they encounter the police, it creates a range of public health issues, everything from police killings to beatings to mental health issues, right? So this kind of fear of encountering the police, the fear of the violence of police. So these are issues that get aggravated in this kind of public health situation because those are issues that already exist, right? Without the pandemic, all of these public health issues that the police create are already there, right? So they're only amplified as a result of the pandemic, right? And that's definitely what we're seeing, I think, in Puerto Rico, as well as in the US, in US communities of color, right? In the diaspora communities that are throughout the US, right? We're seeing that the police are engaging in violence as they're enforcing social distancing measures, right? So we've seen numerous instances of people, instead of, if they're not wearing a mask, instead of being given a mask and then the police move on their way, right? They're tackled to the ground, they're held, right? All of these situations are actually situations that increase vectors of illness, right? Or we're seeing, or in the case of what we saw in New York, where there was a supposed violation of the 6 feet rule of social distancing, and the police tackled a Black man to the ground. They put their knee on his neck, right, which is an illegal kind of hold, and all of that, right, instead of just saying, keep your distance, right? So we see that these are issues that become incredibly volatile, right? When there's already a kind of pressure cooker situation where people are scared. And we see that policing is really uneven, right? And so this is what we've seen in Puerto Rico, as well as in the US. But if we look at the case of Giovanni Roberto, right, where he is arrested during a protest, which was in cars, right? Which he had a mask on, right? He's arrested by police who were not wearing a mask. who are not themselves practicing the things they're supposed to enforce, and then is taken to jail, which we know is a huge site of infection, right? Because of the lack of hygiene and the lack of ability, which is not lack of hygiene on the part of the incarcerated folks or the imprisoned folks, but lack of hygiene from authorities who withhold things like soap and water and sanitizer, right? But is taken to then jail and is not able to like socially distance, right? So these are kind of some of the issues that we're seeing across the kind of gamut in terms of what are some of the issues with using police in these kind of public health situations.
Y en el caso de Puerto Rico, en efecto, nosotros lamentablemente lo dijimos desde el primer día, pero en efecto la policía se convirtió en un foco de contagio extremo, porque la policía, la última vez que hicimos el análisis, estaba 27 veces más contagiada que el resto de la población. Precisamente siempre dijimos desde el principio, ¿verdad? Que la idea de mandar a la policía a intervenir con gente, a arrestar gente, montarlos en patrulla, llevarlos al cuartel, era descabellada, precisamente porque, ¿verdad? Lo que iba a producir era más contagios. Lo mismo con los puntos de cotejo y con otras instancias, pero también iba a mencionar que no es solamente, el problema no es solamente con los policías que decidan ser o que son violentos con la ciudadanía, es que en el caso de Puerto Rico, eso siempre lo hay, y en Puerto Rico han sido muy agresivos y muy intimidantes, ha habido mucha amenaza, nosotros lo estamos documentando estos casos, así que sabemos un poco de lo que hay en cuanto a los arrestos, a las intervenciones por toque de queda, pero no es solamente, porque hay policías que no asumen estas posiciones súper violentas con la ciudadanía, hay policías que son más solidarios y no asumen esa actitud, pero el problema es que aquí es el Estado el que está diciendo que violar el toque de queda puede llevar hasta 6 meses de cárcel. Entonces, aún si no son violentos contigo en la calle y intervienen contigo de forma cortés o educada, es absurdo, ¿verdad? Que por un asunto que no conlleva ninguna depravación moral ni criminal, que no es un delito grave, ni es un delito realmente, porque ir al supermercado no puede ser un delito, ¿verdad? Salir a donde, como tú dices, a coger aire tampoco puede serlo. Pues eso ya tiene una connotación tan y tan punitiva que no sé cómo realmente eso puede ser bueno para tratar la pandemia, ¿no?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest issue with that, right, is it's like you said, right, it's not necessarily even, well, two things, right? One is exactly what you said in terms of the kind of contagion factor of the police, right? So the same thing is happening here, where 1 in 5, I think, police officers in the NYPD have tested positive for COVID. In Baltimore, there's reports that 500 officers are positive, and 1 is under investigation for coughing on a Black man that he was arresting, right? So these are the kind of things where, so you have like those cases, right, where you have this kind of threat or this even utilization that because of their job, they might be contagious, right? All of that stuff. But even when that's not the case, right, where you have police officers who are trying to hand out masks, right, are trying to be courteous in their interactions with civilians, are trying to just actually keep people safe, right? People who think that they're there to help. The problem isn't the individual police officers, right? We know that there are plenty of people who are there for what they think are the right reasons to do good in their community, right? And to try and keep people safe. But the problem is the structure of the police, right? Which is like, the police are there to enforce the will of the government through violence, and they're usually concentrated in the communities that are the most vulnerable, right? So even if you have police that are trying to do the right thing, they're there trying to do the right thing in those communities where they're the most likely to interact with people who are already criminalized through a variety of mechanisms, right? So they're more likely to be stationed in Black communities, in low-income communities, and in immigrant communities, right? Where that already creates a situation of fear and mistrust between authorities and civilians, right? And so this is part of what the problem is that it doesn't matter how courteous a police officer is in their interaction with a civilian. What matters is that they're more likely to interact with a civilian in particular areas than in others, right? And that's also part of what we've been seeing. So with the private elite school in Miramar that's going on their caravana and at the beach and whatever, like the police are there as escorts, right? And are looking on and seeing what's happening, right? But if you're talking about areas where there's maybe active sex work in places in Miramar and Condado, right? That's where the police are going to be acting in a very different capacity, right? Than in other neighborhoods. And so that's also part of kind of what the problem is, right? So we have to think about it less from the standpoint of hoping that you get to interact with a nice police officer, right? We hope that the police are courteous with civilians, but to say like the police don't need to be concentrated in particular areas, and the police actually shouldn't be doing this work, right? A lot of this work is work that people can do themselves or that other government agencies should be doing, right? So that's part of what the issue is.
Marisol, tú dijiste algo que a mí me hace mucho sentido en la cabeza, y es lo que y hemos hablado de eso, es que tú dijiste, la policía no es la estructura capacitada para realizar ese trabajo. O sea, en problemas de salubridad como las que tenemos ahora, de un virus, etcétera, el mejor ejercicio, el mejor equipo no es la policía. Podría ser los salubristas, podrían ser los doctores, podrían ser los trabajadores sociales. Sin embargo, lo hemos hablado, ¿verdad? Muchas veces, el gobierno, al no tener nada que ofrecerle al país, lo que ha hecho es sacar a la policía sin recursos, sin instrucciones, sin estructura, a que hagan lo que sea para que la gente se quede en su casa. Entonces, lo que se ha levantado es un ambiente de miedo, ¿verdad? De multas, sí, y el problema sigue pasando. Y ahora mismo, que ya han pasado 50 y tantos días, las pruebas no se han hecho, no hay protocolo, y la gente ya no quiere ni hacerle caso a la policía. Entonces, el problema no se resuelve.
Exactly, right? So this is what we saw after Maria, is this exact thing, right? So after Maria, the police are the same as everyone else, that they are also experiencing, you know, extreme crisis. Maybe they're not able to get out of their houses. We know that a lot of police are usually pulled from rural areas, right? They were impassable following Maria. So we see that the number of police on the streets after Maria was very low, right? And this, like, things were fine, right? Or not things were fine, but people figured out how to do things, and other agencies were able to step in because there was actually an action.
Perdona que pero los semáforos, ¿te acuerdas?
Ajá.
Que no habían semáforos y todo el mundo, y eso funcionaba mejor que cuando había policía dirigiendo las carreteras. Pero sigue, perdón.
No, so that's exactly it, right? So the communities themselves were able to assess what they needed, and this has been part of what we've been seeing in Puerto Rico over the past decade, right? As the debt crisis y Promesa y la Junta y todo eso, as it unfurls, right? Actually, people themselves and communities themselves have been like, the government doesn't offer anything. When the government is there to repress, or it actually makes things more difficult in my life, right? And so the police being kind of a part of that. And so part of what we see, and this is happening with COVID, is that the government doesn't have things to offer, right? They're not doing the appropriate testing. They're acting solely in a repressive kind of role in order to, as the solution to control the virus. And so people are taking it upon themselves, right? And this is what we see as exactly what's being repressed, right? So people like Giovanni Roberto, who is making an argument about people helping each other to make sure that nobody goes hungry, right? And especially that children don't go hungry with schools closed, right? That's who's getting repressed, instead of the government stepping up to make sure that no one goes hungry, right? So there's a repression of people who are actually filling in gaps that are things that the government should be doing, right? And that the police can't and shouldn't be doing, right? The police should not be in charge of making sure people don't go hungry, right? Or that people are doing social distancing or of testing people or whatever, right? Those are all things that there are other facets of the state that should be stepping in, but so much of the state, particularly in Puerto Rico, has been reduced to the role of what the police can do, right? And so this is something that's like really crucial in this moment, which is a moment where a lot of places are doing their annual budgets, right? And so this is something that we've seen in places like California and New York, where we're in the middle of a pandemic and they're cutting public health, but not cutting the budgets for police, right? So Gavin Newsom just announced yesterday that they're making huge cuts in the California state budget to education and to public health. And the idea that you would make cuts to public health in the middle of a pandemic, but things that are not being cut are things that are associated with security, right? And so this is also a moment where I think it's really important for folks to think about budget priorities, right? Because this is a moment where we're seeing that there's a reallocation of resources and a reallocation of funding that needs to be reallocated away from police and into these other kind of social like safety nets or social resources that the police are often asked to fill, and which creates actually more public health problems.
Esa ha sido la situación en Puerto Rico durante todos estos años, incluso, ¿verdad? De todos estos años de austeridad que hemos vivido. Realmente las reducciones significativas de presupuesto de las que tú hablas han sido en esas áreas, o sea, han sido en muchas áreas, pero no ha sido en el área de seguridad. El área de seguridad es una que o se mantiene o incluso aumenta en estos tiempos de crisis económica. Y a mí me gustaría que tú hablaras, antes de entrar en lo del budget, que me parece que es importante, en lo del presupuesto, me gustaría que tú hablaras un poco sobre las implicaciones que eso tiene para unos países que se llaman democráticos y cuya bandera realmente es ¿verdad? La democracia, las libertades, y cómo es posible que en países como el nuestro, ¿verdad? Que aunque sea equivocadamente, siempre se ha llamado, se ha autoproclamado un país democrático, con todas los footnotes que podamos hacer acerca de eso, pero muy especialmente en Estados Unidos, que tú bien conoces, es la misma situación. ¿Con qué implicaciones tiene eso para la democracia, para lo que nosotros aspiramos, que es, ¿verdad?, un gobierno donde haya así unas libertades y unos derechos que se garanticen, que son derechos muy, muy básicos, como el de la...
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the huge question that's not only, I mean, this is the question that actually connects Puerto Rico to the US, but also to Latin America, right? And other places in the global South, which is how do you have any kind of functioning version of democracy, whether we want to put a footnote or an asterisk on it or whatever, but, democracy, how do you have that under conditions of extreme austerity, right? And wealth inequality? It's not possible, right? And I think that's what we've seen is, with all of these kinds of shifts that we would associate with, neoliberalism, or the idea that we're going to take the state out of its responsibility to citizens, right? That we're going to increase the kind of inequalities. We're going to increase measures of austerity to pay for certain things and not others, to the detriment of citizens, right? And non-citizens alike, and use then repressive kind of mechanisms in order to facilitate that kind of economic transformation of the state, right? And I think that that's the thing that we see in places like Chile, in places in Honduras, in Puerto Rico, in Detroit, right? That's the same process. It's a global process that I think what we see is it play out in distinct ways, right? And el caso de Puerto Rico un poco único, right? Because it's a colony, right? So that kind of also then amplifies what is happening already in this super unequal global process, right? And so I think this is the thing that, you know, like Chariana and Lacole always say, like, is there such a thing as a democracy under colonialism, right? It's in many ways kind of an impossibility to reconcile, right? Or what we can think of is that it's a democracy for some people, right, who have freedom of movement, who have access to resources, and not for other. But what we see is that the state then steps back from this idea of being a social provider to being kind of solely a repressive force in the lives of most people. So if we think about, like, particularly in Puerto Rico, if you ask people what their most frequent interaction with the state is, for most people, it's actually just interacting with the police, right? Or interacting with these other kind of incredibly repressive apparatuses, right? So it's just like child welfare, all of these kind of other systems that don't necessarily empower or create a ton of benefits for people, right? So they're interacting with an increasingly repressive state government, right? And they're finding less and less kind of assistance and things that kind of facilitate a good life, right? Or facilitate safety for them, right? And so I think that's like a huge issue that is a point of solidarity between Puerto Rico and all of these other places where and this is the thing that is the most interesting for me in thinking about the timing of when COVID-19, the pandemic started, is that we were seeing this huge wave of protest movements, not only in Puerto Rico, but across kind of the global South, right? And so we can think about what was happening in Chile. We can think about all of these other kind of anti-austerity, pro-democracy, and even pro-socialist kind of movements that were taking root. And then the pandemic comes and those stop, right? And so I think the thing for us to think about is, like, how do we kind of, in the midst of all of this, continue to create those linkages of solidarity between all of these places that are experiencing particular iterations of crisis and anti-democratic austerity measures.
Importante que, ¿verdad?, que hay varios artículos corriendo después de esto del asunto de, ¿verdad?, de la teoría del shock, ¿verdad?, de todo este problema, ¿verdad?, que lo ha traído Naomi Klein, de que el regresar a la normalidad no es una alternativa. Entonces, es un buen momento para reconstruir esto y empezar, como tú dices, ¿verdad?, a rediseñar un nuevo sistema de vida en el que podamos, la mayoría, ¿verdad?, seamos felices. Entonces, ¿cómo pudiéramos abundar en cuanto a eso? ¿A cómo podría reestructurarse ese presupuesto de los gobiernos y de los países para que más gente sea feliz?
And that's what the whole protests in the summer were about, right? The Riquí Renuncia was not just about getting Rosselló out of office, but was actually a moment to say, this is not the way we want to live, right? And we shouldn't have to live like this. And so to actually take a moment to think about what would it mean to actually be able to have life-affirming modes of interaction and social spheres in Puerto Rico, right? To say that right now what the government does is fucking kill people, right? In a variety of ways, either through austerity, through police violence, by starving them, by not giving them jobs, by forcing them to migrate, right? All of those things are all forms of violence and forms of things that shorten people's lives, right? And a lot of what the protests about this summer, like Rosselló becomes a kind of figure in that, but it's also about what he represented. He represented this elite, blanquito, social class that makes itself rich by stealing from everyone, right? And creating this incredibly repressive apparatus to allow that, right? And so I think that's the thing that's really important to know, is that those discussions were already happening, right? And so then how do we keep those discussions going, both in Puerto Rico, but between Puerto Rico and the diaspora too, but also, and between Puerto Rico and all of these other places that are experiencing these moments of saying, like, our lives are valuable And we need to then create a society and structures that enable us to live, you know, lives that are full of health and pleasure and happiness and, you know, wealth in a broad sense, right? Which is about like social wealth as well as economic stability, right? Where people don't have to worry about these things, where these kind of forms of vulnerability are not so intrinsic to what it means to live everyday life.
Sí, mientras tú mencionas eso de, ¿verdad? De los movimientos que hubo de protesta a raíz, pues fue después de, los primeros fueron en Hong Kong y en Puerto Rico, la última ola esa que hubo. Y tú hablas de que, ¿verdad? De cómo uno puede dentro de esta pandemia que estamos viviendo afianzar nuevamente esos lazos, la solidaridad y la búsqueda de cómo retomar esas luchas. Pero mientras tanto, los gobiernos lo que están es reforzando su autoritarismo. Lo que están reforzando es la represión con la excusa, con la justificación o excusa del COVID, de la pandemia. Y tú querías hablarnos un poco sobre cómo están utilizando la tecnología para reforzar ese autoritarismo y esa represión extrema e injustificada a mi parecer. Háblanos un poco de eso que nos mencionaste.
Yeah, we were having a little conversation before the call about this, but yeah, I mean, I think this is a key kind of moment, and these crises are always key moments. You know, we can think of them as these moments where it's a conjuncture, right? Like social movements can increase their power, but repressive states can also do so, right? And it's a struggle, it's a power struggle between kind of social movements and the state, right? And a battle over whose ideas are gonna kind of come out on top. And so we're in one of these moments where we're seeing an incredible amount of mutual aid, an incredible amount of discussion about what are the ways in which people want to live their lives, right? And what kind of world do we want after this? Because like you said, it can't go back to the way it was, right? Normal is not okay, right? Mm-hmm. And so, but the state is also trying to use this in order to promote its kind of accelerate certain kind of ideas and technologies and techniques that would not have been acceptable beforehand, right? So this creates actually an opening for the state to increase increasingly repressive kind of measures towards folks, right? And so we're seeing this in a couple of ways, but one of the most kind of insidious ways that we're seeing this is through surveillance technologies, right? And so in terms of some of the proposals that we're seeing for how to track and deal with COVID and deal with social distancing and deal with rule breakers, right, who might not be adhering to quarantine or curfews and things like that. So some of the proposals that we've been seeing is, for instance, kind of giving access to cell phone GPS information so that you can kind of see where people are. You can see how many people are in a household. Are they like moving about? Are they social distancing? What are they doing? So you're able to track kind of movement, and the state is kind of saying that this is a way to make sure that people are actually adhering, right? That it's for your own good. But the issue with this is, of course, once you kind of let that genie out of the bottle, it's out of the bottle, right? And the police can kind of do what they want with it. And we've seen that when you increase kind of the reach of the police during a crisis, it stays like that, right? And so the most obvious kind of example that I think of all the time is kind of the Patriot Act, right? So a lot of the stuff during 9/11, the erosion of rights and privacy laws, they were justified through the war on terror, right? And the search to hunt out terrorists, right? So there's a way in which there's a similar logic operating during the COVID-19 crisis. And one of the most interesting ones, this is one we were talking about right before we started the recording, is Predpol, right? Which is an organization that is a kind of tracking, surveillance, predictive policing tech company, and their whole claim to fame is that they think that criminals are predictable in much the same way that apex predator animals are, and that they they can predict who is likely to become a kind of violent criminal predator in a community based on particular kind of indicators that correlate very obviously with race, class, and spatial location, right? So what kind of house or residential area does one live in? So like public housing, for instance, or Black communities and other communities of color and low-income communities were more likely to be kind of producing so-called predators. They were likely to victimize other people. So PredPol was basically run out of LA through a massive success of community organizations and activists in LA, precisely because it was incredibly racist. It was incredibly anti-poor and working class. It trafficked in the worst stereotypes about the idea that those populations are criminogenic, or that they themselves produce criminality, right? And so now PredPol, after being run out of LA, is trying to market itself as actually being able to help with COVID-19 in terms of saying, we can predict which communities are going to be more likely to be spreaders, or which communities are going to be more likely to produce people who will break these rules. And it's relying on all of the same kind of ideas about like who are violent, who are problematic populations, which are rooted in these super racist and kind of classist ideas. So the thing that is, I think, really key for us is like, we want the police or we want the state, rather, we want the state to do contact tracing, to try and shorten the kind of linkages in the chain of contagion, right? We want widespread testing, right? But the question becomes like, are the police the ones that should be doing that? And so like one of the memes or jokes that I've seen, at least in Puerto Rico, has been like, oh, suddenly the government can't like trace people when tenemos carpeteo and like all of this kind of stuff. And like suddenly the police are like, oh, we have no idea how we would ever carry this out. And there's a truth to that, and that the mechanisms are there for the state to surveil people. But the question is like, do we want the state, do we want to actually empower the state just because it's a pandemic to do that surveillance, right? And actually, do we want the police to be leading the charge in that kind of contact tracing, right? And so that's where we have to be kind of mindful of. This is a moment where there's actually a lot of decisions about like not giving about giving resources to the right places, right? And asking for resources to be allocated to the right places, right? Because the state is going to keep allocating to these security surveillance apparatuses, because it'll help during the crisis, but it'll also help them after, right? And so again, we have to be really careful about always thinking, how can we actually shrink the resources that are allocated to these kind of more repressive arms of the state, and think about like, how do we actually get widespread testing, which is about the availability of kits, right? Or the things that will actually make people be able to stay home are things like stipends, right? So that they can stay home, increased welfare benefits, the kind of continuance of school lunches, but perhaps through delivery, right? There are already alternatives that a lot of people are thinking about of what would enable people to stay home, right? And to keep themselves safe, that actually have nothing to even do with social distancing necessarily, or enforcing a kind of idea of social distancing, that are just like, these are matters of life and death for folks, of being able to go out and work, right? Precisely because the state isn't giving people what they need in order to be able to stay home, right?
Hay toda una narrativa de que, o sea, tú lo que propones, y en Estados Unidos este discurso que propone Marisol está mucho más adelantado que en Puerto Rico, y es el tema de incidir en las divisiones de los presupuestos para lograr, ¿verdad?, que se le quite presupuesto a las agencias de seguridad para invertir en las agencias que proveen servicios sociales y económicos para la ciudadanía. Y es una idea absolutamente ¿verdad?, importantísima para quienes promovemos la equidad social, sobre todo la equidad socioeconómica. porque no hay manera de afrontar estos tiempos si no es precisamente, ¿verdad? Tratando de eliminar o de equiparar un poco las grandes brechas que existen entre los bien ricos, que son muy pocos, y la gente muy pobre, que es mucha gente. Entonces, una manera de hacerlo pues es mediante la asignación del presupuesto, pero en Puerto Rico tú dices que le quiten dinero a la policía, y eso es como decir que tú estás a favor de los criminales, que tú no quieres que la policía atienda el problema de inseguridad pública que hay en el país, ¿verdad? Como si darle más recursos hubiese funcionado en algún momento contra la criminalidad, que nunca ha funcionado realmente. Y tampoco se habla de que hay pocos policías en Puerto Rico, eso no es cierto. Hay menos que lo que habían antes, pero en Puerto Rico hay mucha menos población también de la que había antes.
Yeah, this is something that I came across in my research a lot, because this is this idea, right, where if and the politicians promote this, right, if you talk about less police or less money for the police, then you're pro-criminal, right? And this is something that under Rosselló Sr., right, it was huge, right, under Mano contra el Crimen. But, you know, the thing that's interesting is the police themselves, if you look at government archival materials, which I have, is that you see the police themselves say, we don't need this many police. And they actually police. So one of the things that we see after Rosselló, under the Sila Maria Calderon administration, is that they hire outside like assessors, right, consultants to come in, and they hire someone from the New Orleans Police Department to institute this kind of wide-ranging reform. And they were like, I can't believe how many police you have in Puerto Rico. Why, right? And where it was a shocking revelation to folks from the US, right? And this is during a time where the police was ramping up in the US, and it was even shocking then. And so during that administration, they actually come to a number. So at that time, it was like 20,000 police or something in the force, around there, 20,000 police. And they were like, actually in Puerto Rico, and that's when, before the massive migration exodus, right, pre-Promesa, they were like, the PRPD, if we want them well-trained, we want them well-equipped, we could do it 10 to 11,000 officers. And that's from the police commissioner at the time, right? And that's in internal documents of the Consejo de Seguridad, right, del gobierno. And so the police themselves acknowledge there doesn't need to be, 20,000 police officers on the streets. Like, the issue is not that there aren't enough police, it's that the issue is that there are plenty of police, and they're in particular neighborhoods, and they're doing things that aren't particularly helpful for most people, right? And so that's kind of what the issue is. And so I think, what you said is one of the things that was really interesting is you said that kind of conversation around these kind of interventions in the budgets is a little bit more developed in the US, but there's actually models that are really successful in Puerto Rico of this, which is the Taller Salud, right, and Acuerdo de Paz, where we see that the Taller Salud and Acuerdo de Paz are actually able to use citizen resources with some financial help from the government to reduce violence, because they were able to figure out what was actually causing the violence, instead of the police, who were saying what's causing the violence in Loíza es droga porque siempre hay droga, right? And what they're like is like, that's actually not what the issue that's causing violence here. And so we see there are actually models in Puerto Rico that say, like, when you take the resources that you would have given to put, 500 police in Loíza, instead of paying for that, and you give it to a community organization that's already thinking about and identifying what the root causes of the problems in that community are, you have greater success, right? And the government acknowledged that program was incredibly successful, wanted to replicate it, talked about replicating it, and then Promesa happens, right? And so instead, they're like, we can't be giving money to these community organizations, but we're going to keep giving money to the police, right? Because there's always a line item in the budget for that. And so there are these kind of discussions that or examples that are in Puerto Rico that are so successful and that show us, I think, how to move forward and think about, like, when you give the resources to the communities and you have a plan for those resources, the success is incredible.
Hay un comentario sobre eso en el live, Luis, o una pregunta, puedes leerla porque yo no lo veo aquí.
¿Cuál de todas? Lo de los efectos del Cop Watch, de los
Ajá.
programas de Cop Watch y de Preventing Police Abuse and Violence. ¿Cómo eso afecta? De David Galarza.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is
Eso es un ejemplo de, ¿verdad? Como
yeah, so Cop Watch is, and I was just reading about this. I'm reading a history of the Young Lords right now, this book by Joanna Fernandez. And, you know, Cop Watch comes out in the 60s from the Black Panthers and the Young Lords. So it's got a Puerto Rican and Black imprint, which is great. So it's a good model for us moving forward. But I think, yeah, Cop Watch is one of these programs, right? But that's about intervening in and acknowledging that interactions between civilians and police are antagonistic almost by default, right? And because of the way that the policing is set up and structured. And so part of the thing is, like, how do we get, like, Cop Watch is important because it stops people from being brutalized and killed, right? Or it stops excess, fabrication of cases, all of that kind of stuff. But the larger question is, like, how do we actually not even have to have a Cop Watch, because we have less police in situations where they have the opportunity to intervene with civilians, right? And so I think, like, we have Cop Watch as a kind of first defense to keep people safe, right? Because these interactions are happening, and it's shown that when there are bystanders, those interactions have less potential to turn deadly. It doesn't mean they don't turn deadly, but they have less of a potential to turn deadly. But then the next step beyond that is then how do you actually prevent those interactions, period, right? Where do you make it so that there's less interaction with the potential to end in violence or antagonism or mistrust, right?
Es bien interesante.
Me vas a mandar a cortar. Que yo sé que tú me vas a mandar a cortar ya, pero...
No. A mí me gusta mucho lo que estás hablando, porque precisamente en estos momentos, ¿verdad? Donde la situación en Puerto Rico cada vez está más difícil. Por ejemplo, las personas sin hogar que están en la calle buscando alternativas. Y,
where are they supposed to socially distance, right? Exactly.
Ajá, entonces, como si trabajamos con ellos, pues, por ejemplo, recientemente se han estado dando escalamientos, por ejemplo, las casas donde lo que están buscando es comida. Pero entonces la policía está por ahí buscando a quién arrestar. Sin embargo, si los recursos estuvieran para estas personas, ellos no tenían que vigilar nada, porque la cosa estaría más resuelta. Son asuntos como eso.
Hay un mensaje de Sandra Bracero. Hola desde New Rochelle, Nueva York. Y Auricita Torres dice: muchos policías, muchos centros comerciales, muchos fast foods. Así es. Saludos también a Adi Martínez, que está por ahí también viéndonos. Luis, yo sé que tú me vas a mandar a cortar, pero quería hacer una última pregunta. ¿Podré?
Sí.
¿Verdad? Nosotros no estamos pagando aquí por un tiempo X.
Por eso esto es... Nosotros, tú mandas.
Nosotros somos los dueños de la estación, ¿verdad?
Exacto. Y Marisol, si quieres estar aquí una hora, 2 horas. Pues,
no, porque tratamos de ser disciplinados con los 45 minutos para que la gente nos extrañe después y se quede como con las ganas. Pero no quiero irme sin preguntarte algo que me parece importante, que pusiste en las notas que hicimos para esta entrevista. Nosotros tenemos una campaña que se llama Exige Acción ante la otra pandemia, ¿verdad? Y como nosotros trabajamos en el ámbito de la seguridad pública, la hemos destinado específicamente a la policía, un poco también para precisamente lo que estamos hablando, para entendiendo que hay que quitarle recursos a la vigilancia esa del toque de queda extrema, de estar interviniendo con cada persona que esté en la calle, y ponerla en donde más haría falta, que es en la respuesta oportuna y rápida, ¿no?, a las víctimas de violencia doméstica, que tanto nos preocupan porque están, como ocurrió durante el huracán María, están encerradas en sus casas con sus agresores. y es en tiempos normales y no se asegura la
Right.
respuesta de la policía, pues nosotros hemos insistido en que esto es un buen momento para abordar el toque de queda desde esa perspectiva, en vez de estar arrestando gente que está yendo al supermercado o lo que sea, ¿verdad? Que la policía debe poner más recursos en esa situación. Pero tú tenías un comentario sobre la respuesta, ¿verdad?, de la policía a la violencia de género, y yo quería que hablaras de eso antes de que cerremos.
Yeah, I mean, it's again this kind of idea of not being really careful with allocating and asking for more police, right? And so I think there's a way in which this has been a huge kind of flashpoint in the feminist movement, right? With, you know, what we call carceral feminism, right? To be really careful that when we're trying to keep women safe, right, or gender nonconforming people, children, kind of vulnerable populations, right, that we don't rely again on an idea that the police are the people that keep them safe, because often the police are actually, as we know, incredibly involved in domestic violence, right? So a lot of women are shut in with their aggressors who are police too, right? And so we know that, and this has been documented by the Department of Justice, right, that a huge percentage, particularly in the PRPD, but across police forces under US jurisdictions, have high rates of domestic violence, right? And so to ask those people who are actually themselves involved in domestic violence to then become involved in protecting folks who are experiencing domestic violence, there's a kind of problem there, right? And so one of the things that we want to be careful is that, you know, we think about there is an epidemic of domestic violence is occurring right now, right? And so one of the things that we have to be really careful about is thinking about what are the ways that we can address those issues of domestic violence that actually you don't even need to involve any kind of criminal justice apparatus, right, in order to address, right? So the fact that women are shut in, or queer folks, right, who might be shut in with an abusive family, right? Those folks, what they need is housing, right? And access to a safe place to go, right? What they need is access to employment before the pandemic happened, right? A fair social wage so that they would have the resources to leave that situation if they needed to, right? But if they don't have the resources, then what we actually need is the state to come in and provide them with a place to go, right? Or provide them with the resources that they need, right? And so the police are going to write citations. They're going to arrest that person, and it does, as we've seen, right? Domestic abusers get arrested and they go back and they kill the person that they were abusing, right? Because then they're like, it doesn't stop. What's at the root problem is that the people don't have the resources to get out of that situation when they need it desperately, right? So this becomes part of the problem. And so this has been a huge kind of debate within abolitionist kind of police and prison abolitionist circles, but also within feminist circles and activists, with like, there's violence happening and that people are dying, and how do you address that without actually giving resources to this kind of organization or structure that is actually often participates in that violence, or that actually is not equipped to deal with that violence, right? So we know that having more women police officers doesn't always help, right? Having police that are trained in it doesn't even always help, right? And so the things that actually tend to help are actually outside of that police structure, and tend to be things like related to employment, housing, health, and food security.
Importante.
Es interesante, es un tema obviamente muy complejo, ¿verdad? Que no lo vamos a resolver aquí, pero nosotros creemos que, primero, lo más importante de esto es que esta campaña se hace en coordinación con otros grupos feministas que tienen otras opciones y que están haciendo no la misma campaña, pero están haciendo campañas simultáneamente, nosotras dirigidas al Estado, pero otras organizaciones como a las que pertenezco, como el propio Observatorio de Equidad de Género, del cual somos fundadoras, como Proyecto Matria, con quien colaboramos, y otros grupos, la Coordinadora Paz para la Mujer, que han asumido el trabajo el asunto ¿verdad? De proveer recursos durante la pandemia para las víctimas de violencia de género, porque no lo ha hecho el Estado, pues ellas tienen otros recursos y herramientas que simultáneamente están ofreciendo a las comunidades para que intervengan en estos casos, ¿verdad? O sea, no pretendemos solamente descansar en la policía, ¿verdad? Definitivamente que no. Se están dando también recursos para que la ciudadanía se pueda activar y pueda intervenir en estos asuntos que ahora mismo pues son una emergencia. Pero definitivamente, pues, y entonces en la policía hemos visto que, por ejemplo, las divisiones de violencia doméstica, muchas de ellas funcionan. Una vez se adiestran bien, funcionan incluso en colaboración con algunos albergues, con organizaciones que proveen servicios. Lo que pasa es que es muy difícil que un policía raso pueda intervenir en asuntos de violencia doméstica si no tiene no solamente el adiestramiento solo no sirve, sino también el apoyo comunitario de estas organizaciones que también trabajan este tema. Es muy difícil que la policía entonces se pueda encargar, ¿verdad? Pero sí, para el asunto de tratar de evitar muertes de las personas que ya están en peligro, ¿verdad? Pues nosotros entendemos que tiene que haber medidas y sistemas de alerta creados por el Estado y que sean especiales para el aislamiento, para que las mujeres tengan esa opción, que tú no vas a poder llamar por teléfono a nadie en este momento, ¿no? Tú tienes que poder, como hicieron en España o en Argentina, eso que tú mencionas, en Argentina se han puesto a la disposición de las personas en situación de violencia de género, se han puesto habitaciones de hotel disponibles, ya que los hoteles están vacíos, ¿ves?
Yeah.
Todas esas son ideas que hemos hecho recomendaciones específicas a la policía con muchas, ¿verdad? Basándonos en estas experiencias, la de España, que las mujeres pueden ir a la farmacia y decir mascarilla 19 y ya se sabe, se activa un protocolo de emergencia para intervenir por esa mujer. Pero en Puerto Rico ahora mismo tú vas y pides mascarilla 19 y nadie sabe qué va a hacer eso. ¿Sabes por qué? Porque el Estado no ha movilizado un solo recurso para atender esta situación tan extrema.
Yeah, I think that's what you're saying exactly is the key thing, right? Is that this is also a moment where it's up to kind of the folks who are working with these with women and others who are experiencing violence in the home, right? They identify what are the things they need, because what the state's going to say is they're going to be like, we'll have more women officers who are trained to deal with domestic violence survivors in a more courteous way or a more sensitive way, right? Or we'll increase, like those are the solutions that are on offer, right? It's like, oh, the problem is that the police officers who are men who deal with domestic violence, they don't believe them, or they don't take action, right? And so then the solution becomes, oh, we need more women police officers, right? Which then gives resources to the police to grow, right? And so that's exactly what you're saying, right? Is it's like there are women who are in danger right now that, like, a restraining order or other measures are the thing that might save their lives, right? In this particular moment. But then it's about, like, how do we take short-term steps while looking at the long-term kind of things that are needed to reduce that, right? To actually give people the things that they need to immediately be able to get out of those situations, or to avoid kind of having to then rely on the state, to empower kind of communities to work together to deal with some of these kind of issues, because we know that sending people to jail and prison is not going to actually reduce violence in communities. It tends to exacerbate those issues of violence, right?
Muy bien, pues mira, pon orden aquí, Luis.
Mira, no, es que yo creo que es importante, y que quizás tengamos esa conversación luego, Marisol, de cómo podemos empezar a tener esas conversaciones que la gente no quiere tener sobre el tema de la policía, y, ¿verdad? Ir ejecutando decisiones, ¿verdad? O manejando presupuestos, como tú dices, para atender unas problemáticas y no tener que estar dependiendo tanto de la policía como el que va a resolver los problemas sociales, porque definitivamente no lo ha sido, no lo va a hacer, y tenemos que nosotros entonces fortalecer otros programas para que el cambio empiece a darse en pequeños pasos, como tú dices, y también mirar a largo plazo. Pero esas conversaciones las tenemos que tener, no las queremos tener, son difíciles, pero ¿para cuándo lo vamos a dejar? Así que yo creo que quizás te volvemos a invitar para que nos ayudes a dialogar sobre eso, sobre qué otras cosas se están haciendo en otros lugares que podemos empezar a implementar en Puerto Rico. Yo no me quería ir antes de que dijéramos, ¿verdad? Hablábamos anteriormente de que precisamente recientemente se puede decir que se recuerdan 50 años del asesinato de Antonia Martínez, ¿verdad? Una mujer, una joven que fue asesinada por la policía hace 50 años y todavía hoy seguimos batallando la situación. Quiere decir que en 50 años, ¿verdad? La problemática continúa. Pensamos que la justicia tardía no es justicia, así que a 50 años después se dé un bachillerato a su familia, me parece que es algo absurdo, pero sí es importante que nosotros hablemos sobre eso. No queríamos irnos antes de que la gente que está viéndonos hable sobre el tema de Antonia Martínez, qué pasó, por qué sigue pasando en Puerto Rico todavía este tipo de agresión de parte de la policía a la ciudadanía y cómo podemos cambiar eso, porque yo creo que nosotros lo podemos cambiar si nos organizamos y accionamos. ¿Y alguien más quiere decir algo para despedirnos?
Thank you.
Gracias.
Bueno, todo fue súper bien, brutal estar aquí con ustedes y it's awesome. I love talking with you guys always, so this is great.
Qué bueno, yo también estoy contenta de que hayas estado con nosotros. Yo sé que vas a volver ya eventualmente. Así que nada, gracias a ambos. Y vamos a hacer un programa de Antonia, Luis, ¿verdad?
Sí, vamos a hacerlo.
Lo estábamos hablando ahorita, vamos a hacer un programa de Antonia. A mí me pareció agridulce lo del bachillerato, porque yo juraba que eso ya se lo habían dado a la familia, hacía, qué sé yo, 40 y pico de años atrás. Me sorprendió, pero pues, ¿verdad? Mejor tarde que nunca, pero me pareció demasiado tarde.
Exacto.
Pero ya hablaremos de eso, Marisol. Gracias por haber estado acompañándonos hoy.
Gracias a ustedes.
Espero que volvamos pronto a hacer algo de verdad en persona, que tú puedas volver a Puerto Rico pronto a hacer la investigación y que nos inventemos algo.
Sí, gracias.
Ok, gracias Luis. Nos vemos la semana que viene.
Nos vemos.